The courtroom camera captured the exact moment when everything changed. Richard Blackwell III, CEO of Black Tech Solutions, stood before Judge Frank Caprio in his $3,000 Italian suit, his Rolex Submariner catching the overhead lights as he adjusted his cufflinks with the casual arrogance of someone who had never faced real consequences in his entire 42 years of life. What happened in the next 90 seconds would shatter his world completely and become the most viral courtroom moment in internet history. Racked up over 75 million views across every social media platform in less than 48 hours. The words that came out of his mouth would haunt him forever, echoing through every courthouse in America as the perfect example of what happens when wealth meets accountability. Rules don't apply to people like me. Your Honor. 5 words that would destroy a $500 million empire, end a career built on privilege, and send a message that resonated with millions of people who were sick and tired of watching rich people escape justice. But here's what makes this story absolutely insane, and why you need to pay attention to every single word. This wasn't just about a parking ticket. Judge Frank Caprio, known worldwide as the kindest, most compassionate judge in America, the man who had gone viral 100 times for crying with defendants and dismissing tickets for struggling families, had spent 3 days investigating Richard Blackwell III. What he discovered was so damning, so absolutely criminal that it would end with the CEO being let out of the courtroom in handcuffs, while the entire gallery erupted in applause. The arrogant billionaire had walked in thinking he was dealing with a soft, small-town judge. He had no idea he was about to face the full weight of judicial authority from a man who had finally had enough of entitled rich people treating the legal system like a customer service desk, where everything could be solved with a checkbook. Richard Blackwell III wasn't just any CEO. He was the poster child for everything wrong with American corporate culture. Born into wealth, handed a company by his father, he had spent his entire adult life proving that money could buy immunity from consequences. His pattern of behavior read like a textbook on narcissistic entitlement. At 16, his first DUI mysteriously disappeared when Daddy hired the best lawyers money could buy. At 22, a fraternity hazing incident that put a freshman in the hospital was settled with a multi-million-dollar NDA that buried the truth forever. By 35, he had accumulated 47 traffic violations that he paid off like tipping a waiter, never once appearing in court, never once showing an ounce of remorse or accountability. He treated laws like suggestions for poor people, obstacles that could be removed with the right amount of money and the right connections. His employees described a culture of fear and abuse at Black Tech Solutions, where he ruled like a dictator, firing people on whims, harassing staff members, and creating an environment so toxic that 17 former employees currently had active lawsuits against him. But Richard Blackwell truly believed he was untouchable, that his wealth and status placed him above the rules that governed ordinary people. The incident that brought him to Judge Caprio's courtroom seemed simple on the surface. A parking ticket. Richard Blackwell had parked his $200,000 Mercedes in a disabled parking spot directly outside Rhode Island Children's Hospital for 4 straight hours, while he enjoyed a leisurely lunch at an exclusive restaurant across the street. When a hospital security guard approached him and politely asked him to move because families with disabled children desperately needed that spot, Blackwell had laughed in his face, pulled out a $100 bill, waved it dismissively, and said, "Do you know what I'm worth?" The security guard, a retired Marine named Tom Rodriguez, had written down every word, captured video on his phone, and personally delivered the evidence to the police department. But what Richard Blackwell didn't know, what he couldn't have possibly imagined in his wildest nightmares, was that his arrogance that day had real consequences for real people. While he sat in that restaurant sipping wine and closing business deals, an 8-year-old cancer patient named Emily Martinez and her mother Rosa had circled the hospital parking lot for 45 agonizing minutes, desperately searching for a disabled spot so they could make Emily's critical chemotherapy appointment. Emily, sitting in her wheelchair in the back seat, was crying from pain and nausea. Rosa was crying from helplessness and fear, watching the clock tick past their appointment time, knowing that delays in treatment could mean the difference between remission and relapse. They finally found parking 3 blocks away and arrived at the hospital 47 minutes late, forcing doctors to reschedule Emily's treatment, a delay that caused medical complications that would affect her recovery. All because Richard Blackwell III believed his lunch meeting was more important than a child's access to life-saving medical care. Judge Frank Caprio had built his reputation on compassion, on seeing the humanity in every defendant who walked through his courtroom doors. He had dismissed countless tickets for struggling single mothers, for elderly people on fixed incomes, for anyone who showed genuine remorse and respect for the legal process. His viral videos had made him a beloved figure, a symbol of judicial kindness in a system often seen as cruel and impersonal. But what people didn't understand about Frank Caprio was that his compassion had limits, and those limits were crossed when someone showed contempt not just for the law, but for basic human decency. When Richard Blackwell's case landed on his desk, Judge Caprio did something he rarely did. He investigated. For 3 solid days, his court staff dug into every public record, every lawsuit, every complaint, every piece of evidence they could legally access about this arrogant CO who thought a parking ticket was beneath his attention. What they found made Judge Caprio's blood boil. This wasn't just a one-time mistake by a busy executive. This was a pattern of behavior by a predator who had learned that wealth could buy immunity. And Judge Caprio, whose own granddaughter had cerebral palsy and used a wheelchair, whose family knew firsthand how critical disabled parking access was, decided that this case would become his watershed moment. Richard Blackwell III was about to learn that kindness should never be mistaken for weakness, and that even the nicest judge in America has a breaking point when faced with pure, unfiltered arrogance. Richard Blackwell III had been training for this moment his entire life, though not in the way he imagined. Every time his father's money had made a problem disappear, every time a lawyer had turned criminal charges into civil settlements sealed with NDAs, every time his wealth had transformed consequences into mere inconveniences, he had learned the same fundamental lesson. The rules that govern ordinary people simply did not apply to him. By the time he walked into Judge Caprio's courtroom that Tuesday morning, he had 42 years of evidence proving this theory correct. His entire existence had been a masterclass in how privilege creates monsters, how unchecked wealth corrupts character, and how a system designed to provide equal justice can be perverted when enough money enters the equation. The parking ticket wasn't an aberration in Richard Blackwell's life. It was perfectly consistent with who he had always been, who he had been raised to be, and who he fully intended to remain until the day he died. But that day was about to become the inflection point where his carefully constructed reality would collide with actual accountability, and the impact would shatter everything he believed about himself and his place in the world. The pattern of entitlement started early and escalated predictably. At age 14, Richard had crashed his father's Porsche while joyriding with friends, putting 2 of them in the hospital with serious injuries. The police report mysteriously vanished. The families received generous settlements in exchange for silence, and Richard learned that even vehicular assault could be solved with a family checkbook. At 19, during his brief stint at an Ivy League university before his father simply bought him a degree from a more accommodating institution, he had been accused of sexual assault by a female student. The university's investigation stalled when the Blackwell family donated a new library wing, and the young woman transferred schools under circumstances that were never fully explained. Richard learned that even the most serious allegations could be managed with strategic philanthropy and well-placed threats. By his mid-20s, when he took over Black Tech Solutions from his ailing father, Richard had refined his approach to consequences into a science. Everything had a price, every problem had a solution, and that solution always involved money, lawyers, or both. His behavior at Black Tech Solutions revealed the true depth of his character, or rather, the complete absence of it. Employees who had worked under Richard described a workplace environment that bordered on abusive. He would scream at assistants until they cried, fire people in front of their colleagues for the smallest mistakes, and create a culture where fear was the primary motivator. One former executive assistant described how Richard had thrown a laptop at her head during a meeting because she had scheduled a conference call incorrectly. When she threatened to file assault charges, the company's legal team descended immediately with a settlement offer of $150,000 and an NDA that prohibited her from ever speaking about her experience. She took the money because she needed to pay her mortgage and support her children, and Richard learned once again that violence could be purchased into silence. The 17 former employees with current lawsuits against Black Tech represented just a fraction of the people Richard had abused, bullied, harassed, and discarded over his career. Most had taken settlements and signed away their right to tell their stories. But these 17 had decided that enough was enough, that some things mattered more than money, and that Richard Blackwell needed to face consequences for once in his privileged life. The disabled parking violations told an even darker story. This wasn't Richard's first offense at the Children's Hospital. It wasn't even his sixth. Court records that Judge Caprio's team uncovered showed a disturbing pattern over the previous 8 months. Richard had been ticketed for disabled parking violations 9 separate times across 3 different cities, always at medical facilities, always during business hours when those spots were most needed by patients and their families. Each time, he had simply paid a fine online, never appeared in court, treated it like a parking meter he had forgotten to feed. The fines ranged from $250 to $500, amounts that represented less than what Richard spent on a single bottle of wine at his exclusive country club. But the pattern revealed something more sinister than mere convenience. Richard Blackwell actively chose to park in disabled spots because he believed his time and comfort were more valuable than the mobility needs of people with disabilities. He had once told a business associate, caught on a recording that would later surface during investigations, that disabled parking spots were always closest to the entrance, and he wasn't going to walk an extra 50 feet just because some bleeding hearts wanted to virtue signal about accessibility. This wasn't ignorance. This wasn't thoughtlessness. This was calculated contempt for people he considered beneath him. Judge Caprio's investigation had also uncovered something that would prove devastating to Richard's defense. Security camera footage from the Children's Hospital showed the entire incident in crystal clear detail. Richard pulling into the disabled spot, clearly seeing the signage, clearly seeing the painted wheelchair symbol on the pavement. Tom Rodriguez, the security guard, approaching respectfully and explaining that families with disabled children needed that spot. Richard's response, captured perfectly on audio, was chilling in its casual cruelty. He had laughed, actually laughed, and said, "Look around, buddy. You see any crippled kids right now? I'll be gone in an hour." When Tom explained that Emily Martinez was circling the lot looking for that exact spot, Richard had pulled out his wallet, extracted a $100 bill, and said, "Here's $100. Go buy yourself a sense of humor and stop wasting my time." The video showed him walking away while Tom stood there, stunned and helpless, watching this wealthy man treat human dignity like a transaction he could opt out of with cash. That footage was sitting in Judge Caprio's folder, along with Tom's written statement, Emily's medical records showing the treatment delay, and Rosa Martinez's tearful account of watching her daughter suffer because someone's lunch reservation was more important than her child's cancer treatment. Richard Blackwell had prepared for his court appearance with the same arrogance that defined his entire approach to life. He had watched several of Judge Caprio's viral videos online, the ones where the judge dismissed tickets for elderly veterans, where he cried with struggling single mothers, where his compassion and humanity shone through every ruling. Richard's conclusion was predictable and catastrophically wrong. This judge is a pushover, he had told his attorney over drinks the night before the hearing. He's all feelings and sympathy. I'll offer to donate $10,000 to some charity. He'll get teary-eyed, case dismissed, and I'll be back in my office before lunch. His attorney, a seasoned professional who had extracted Richard from numerous legal problems over the years, had advised a different approach. Show remorse, apologize sincerely, pay the fine without complaint, and move on. But Richard Blackwell had never apologized sincerely for anything in his entire life, and he wasn't about to start with some small-town traffic court judge who made his reputation by being soft on poor people. He walked into that courtroom with his checkbook in his pocket, his practiced expression of mild concern on his face, and absolutely zero understanding that he was about to experience the first real consequences of his 42 years of unchecked privilege. The courtroom was unusually packed for what should have been a routine traffic violation hearing. Local news crews had received an anonymous tip that something significant might happen, though nobody could predict just how spectacular the proceedings would become. Rosa Martinez sat in the third row with Emily beside her in her wheelchair, both of them nervous but hopeful that maybe, just maybe, someone would finally hold this arrogant man accountable for the suffering he had caused. Former Black Tech employees scattered throughout the gallery, drawn by rumors that their tormentor might finally face justice. The bailiff called the court to order as Judge Frank Caprio entered, his expression neutral, but his eyes sharp and observant, taking in every detail of the scene before him. Richard Blackwell sat at the defendant's table flanked by his attorney, scrolling through his phone with a bored expression of someone waiting for an oil change, completely oblivious to the fact that his life was about to change forever. He had worn his most expensive suit, his most impressive watch, projecting an image of success and importance that he believed would intimidate or impress this small-town judge into quick resolution. When Judge Caprio asked him to put away his phone and stand to address the court, Richard complied with an exaggerated sigh that echoed through the silent courtroom. His first mistake in what would become a cascade of catastrophic errors in judgment. Judge Caprio began with his characteristic calm professionalism, reviewing the basic facts of the case. Mr. Blackwell, you've been cited for parking in a designated disabled parking space at Rhode Island Children's Hospital for approximately 4 hours on the afternoon of March 15th. The fine for this violation is typically $250. But I understand there are some additional circumstances we need to discuss. How do you plead to this charge? Richard's attorney started to respond, but Richard held up his hand, silencing his own lawyer with the casual dismissiveness of someone who believed he knew better than professionals he paid to protect him. Your Honor, I plead guilty to the parking violation. I'm a busy man, and I made a mistake in judgment. I'm prepared to pay the fine right now and make a substantial donation to the court's charity fund to show my goodwill and commitment to the community. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his checkbook, literally beginning to write while Judge Caprio was still speaking, the pen scratching across the paper in the dead silence of the courtroom. The audible gasps from the gallery seemed to puzzle Richard, who looked around with genuine confusion, unable to comprehend why people were reacting so negatively to what he considered a generous offer. Judge Caprio's voice cut through the murmurs with surgical precision. Mr. Blackwell, please put away your checkbook. This is a court of law, not a transaction at your country club. We will address the matter of payment if and when I determine what the appropriate penalty should be. For now, I'd like you to explain to me why you chose to park in a disabled spot when there were other parking options available. Richard's face flushed slightly, the first sign of irritation breaking through his practiced composure. Your Honor, I had an important business lunch at the restaurant across the street. The disabled spot was convenient and close to the entrance. I didn't think it would be a problem for an hour or two. I mean, it's just a parking spot. Judge Caprio leaned forward slightly, his eyes never leaving Richard's face. Just a parking spot? Mr. Blackwell, that spot is designated for people with disabilities who need close access to a children's hospital. Did that consideration factor into your decision at all? Richard's irritation was growing more visible now, his body language shifting from casual confidence to defensive annoyance. With all due respect, Your Honor, I think you're making a bigger deal out of this than it needs to be. I've already said I'll pay the fine. I'm a job creator. I pay substantial taxes, and I contribute to the local economy. This feels like you're trying to make an example out of me just because I'm successful. The temperature in the courtroom dropped several degrees as Judge Caprio's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. The audience members who had watched his show for years recognized a subtle shift, the tightening around his eyes that signaled his patience was being tested. Mr. Blackwell, let me ask you a direct question. Do you believe that laws apply equally to everyone, regardless of their economic status or professional success? Richard actually smiled, completely missing the warning signs that everyone else in the courtroom could see clearly. Of course they do, Your Honor. That's what we're taught in civics class. Everyone is equal under the law. It was the answer of someone who had never truly believed those words, who was simply reciting the socially acceptable response while his entire life proved he lived by a different set of rules. Judge Caprio pressed further, his voice still calm but carrying an edge that made Richard's attorney shift uncomfortably in his seat. But do you personally believe they apply to you, Mr. Blackwell? Do you believe that when you park in a disabled spot, you should face the same consequences as anyone else who commits that violation? This was a moment when Richard Blackwell's arrogance reached critical mass, when every lesson he had learned about wealth-buying immunity, when every experience of escaping consequences through money and privilege when every ounce of entitled superiority that had been building for 42 years came pouring out in a torrent of words that would destroy him. He leaned back in his chair, spread his arms wide in a gesture that encompassed the entire courtroom, and addressed not just Judge Caprio, but everyone present, as if he were explaining basic economics to children who couldn't possibly understand the complexities of the real world. Your Honor, let's be honest here. Rules don't apply to people like me. They can't. If successful people got bogged down in every petty regulation and minor violation, nothing would get done in this world. I'm not saying I'm above the law, but the law should be proportional to the value someone brings to society. My time is literally worth more than most people's monthly salary. Every hour I spend dealing with something like this is an hour I'm not creating jobs, not closing deals, not contributing to the economy. I'll pay whatever fine you want. I'll write a check right now for $5,000 if that makes you happy. Just let me get back to running a $500 million company that employs 300 people and generates millions in tax revenue. The silence that followed was absolute and suffocating. 3 full seconds passed where nobody moved, nobody breathed, nobody could quite believe what they had just heard. Richard Blackwell had just articulated on camera, in a court of law, the exact philosophy that Judge Caprio had spent 3 days investigating and confirming through evidence. He had confessed to believing himself above the rules that governed ordinary people, had placed a dollar value on human dignity, had revealed a contempt and arrogance that drove every decision he made. His attorney's face had gone pale, recognizing immediately that his client had just committed legal suicide. The gallery was processing the sheer audacity of what they had witnessed. Rosa Martinez was crying silently, clutching Emily's hand, finally understanding that the man who had caused her daughter such suffering felt absolutely no remorse, no empathy, no recognition that his actions had consequences for real human beings. And Judge Frank Caprio, the kindest judge in America, the man famous for his compassion and his tears, sat back in his chair with an expression that combined disappointment, anger, and steely determination. The trap had been set perfectly, and Richard Blackwell had walked into it with his eyes wide open, never suspecting that his own words would be the weapon used to destroy him. The reckoning was about to begin, and it would be more devastating than anyone in that courtroom could have possibly imagined. Judge Frank Caprio let the silence stretch for another 5 seconds, allowing Richard Blackwell's words to hang in the air like toxic smoke, giving everyone in the courtroom time to fully absorb what they had just witnessed. When he finally spoke, his voice was different from anything his regular viewers had ever heard. The warmth was gone, replaced by something colder, harder, more final. Mr. Blackwell, that was perhaps the most honest thing you've said since walking into my courtroom. You've just admitted on the record that you believe rules don't apply to people like you. Let me tell you what I've learned about people like you. He opened the thick manila folder that had been sitting on his bench since the proceedings began, the folder that Richard had noticed but dismissed as irrelevant paperwork. This is your 6th disabled parking violation in the past 3 months, Mr. Blackwell. 6 separate incidents where you decided your convenience mattered more than accessibility for people with disabilities. But what's particularly interesting is the pattern. Every single violation occurred in a medical facility during peak hours, when those spots were most desperately needed by patients and their families. That's not carelessness. That's not poor judgment. That's calculated contempt for people you consider beneath you. Richard's confident posture began to crack. His attorney tried to interject with objections about relevance, but Judge Caprio raised his hand for silence and continued with relentless precision. I have security footage from the incident in question, Mr. Blackwell. Would you like to see it, or would you prefer I simply describe what it shows? He didn't wait for an answer. The video shows you parking in the disabled spot, clearly seeing the signage and the painted wheelchair symbol. It shows hospital security guard Tom Rodriguez approaching you respectfully and explaining that families with disabled children needed that spot. And it shows your response. Judge Caprio's voice took on a quality of barely controlled anger as he recounted the next part. You laughed in his face, Mr. Blackwell. You pulled out a $100 bill, waved it at him dismissively, and asked if he saw any crippled kids around. Those were your exact words. Crippled kids. When he informed you that a family was actively searching for that spot, you told him to buy himself a sense of humor and stop wasting your time. The courtroom erupted in murmurs of disgust and disbelief. Richard's face had gone from confident to pale, his hands gripping the edge of the table as he realized that his carefully constructed defense was collapsing in real time. Judge Caprio wasn't finished. The camera footage showed something else, Mr. Blackwell. It showed the timestamp. You parked at 11:47 a.m. At 11:52 a.m., exactly 5 minutes after you entered that restaurant, Rosa Martinez and her daughter Emily arrived at the hospital. They spent the next 45 minutes circling the parking lot, desperately searching for a disabled spot so they could access Emily's critical chemotherapy appointment. Mrs. Martinez, would you please stand? Rosa rose on shaking legs, Emily beside her in her wheelchair, both of them visible to everyone in the courtroom, including Richard, who was seeing them for the first time and beginning to understand that this was not going to end the way he had planned. Judge Caprio's voice softened slightly when addressing Rosa, the compassion returning momentarily. Mrs. Martinez, can you tell the court what happened that day because of Mr. Blackwell's choice to occupy that disabled parking space for 4 hours? Rosa's voice trembled but grew stronger as she spoke, describing the agony of watching her daughter cry in pain while they searched for parking, the terror of missing the appointment time, the complications that arose from the delayed treatment, the medical expenses that resulted from those complications. Her testimony was devastating in its simplicity and honesty, painting a picture of real human suffering caused by one man's arrogance and entitlement. When Rosa finished and sat down, Judge Caprio turned his attention back to Richard, and the courtroom could feel the shift in energy like an approaching storm. Mr. Blackwell, you said your time is worth more than most people's monthly salary. Let me introduce you to someone whose time is priceless. He reached under his bench and pulled out a framed photograph, holding it up for Richard and the cameras to see clearly. This is my granddaughter, Sophia. She has cerebral palsy. She uses a wheelchair. She needs disabled parking spots to access buildings safely, to receive medical care, to live her life with the dignity and independence she deserves. When you parked in that spot for 4 hours because your lunch meeting was more important, you didn't just inconvenience people, Mr. Blackwell. You endangered a child's medical treatment. You caused real harm to a real family. And you did it because you genuinely believe that your wealth and your business success make you more important than an 8-year-old girl fighting cancer. The emotion in Judge Caprio's voice was authentic and powerful, and even the most hardened observers in the courtroom found themselves moved by the connection between Sophia's struggle and Emily's suffering. Richard tried to speak, his voice cracking with fear he had never experienced before in any courtroom. Your Honor, I didn't know. I didn't realize anyone was actually affected. I made a mistake, and I'm sorry. But Judge Caprio cut him off with a look that could have frozen fire. You're not sorry you did it, Mr. Blackwell. You're sorry you got caught. You're sorry that for once in your privileged life, there are consequences you can't buy your way out of. My staff conducted something we rarely do for a simple parking violation. We investigated your background thoroughly. Your company, Black Tech Solutions, is currently under SEC investigation for securities fraud involving $45 million in falsified earnings reports. You have 17 former employees with active lawsuits against you for workplace harassment, discrimination, and wrongful termination. I have police reports from 3 different states documenting hit-and-run incidents where you were identified as the driver, but charges mysteriously disappeared after your lawyers got involved. Every word landed like a physical blow, and Richard was visibly shrinking in his chair, all his arrogance evaporating as the full scope of Judge Caprio's investigation became clear. The judge continued his systematic destruction of Richard's carefully constructed facade. You've spent your entire adult life proving that you believe rules truly don't apply to you. You've used your wealth to escape accountability, to silence victims, to corrupt a system designed to provide equal justice under law. But here's what you fail to understand, Mr. Blackwell. My courtroom is not for sale. Your checkbook means nothing here. Your business success means nothing here. Your belief that you're somehow more valuable than the people you've hurt means absolutely nothing here. Richard's attorney was frantically scribbling notes, probably already planning appeals and legal strategies. But even he knew that what was happening transcended normal courtroom procedure. This was a reckoning, a moment of pure accountability that Richard Blackwell had successfully avoided for 42 years until today. Judge Caprio leaned forward, his hands folded on the bench, his voice carrying the weight of absolute judicial authority. "Mr. Blackwell, you came into my courtroom believing your wealth made you untouchable. You're about to learn a very expensive lesson in humility. For the parking violation in a disabled space, I'm imposing the maximum fine of $500. Richard actually started to smile, relief flooding his features at what seemed like a minor penalty. But Judge Caprio wasn't finished, and his next words would wipe that smile away forever and send shockwaves through every media outlet in America within hours. For contempt of court, based on your disrespectful behavior, your admission that rules don't apply to you, and your complete lack of remorse for the harm you've caused, I'm sentencing you to 30 days in county jail." The courtroom exploded with gasps and murmurs as Richard Blackwell lurched forward in his chair, his face transforming from relief to shock to pure terror in the span of 2 seconds. His attorney jumped to his feet, objecting loudly about disproportionate sentencing and grounds for appeal. But Judge Caprio silenced with a raised hand and continued speaking with the calm authority of someone who considered every legal angle before making this decision. "Additionally, Mr. Blackwell, you were asked by hospital security to move your vehicle, and you refused, which constitutes criminal trespass on hospital property. For that offense, I'm adding an additional 60-day sentence to run consecutively with your contempt charge. That's a total of 90 days in county jail, Mr. Blackwell. 90 days to think about whether rules apply to people like you." The transformation in Richard was complete and devastating. The confident CEO who had strutted into the courtroom checking his Rolex was now standing with his mouth open, his face drained of all color, his hands trembling as the reality of his situation crashed down on him like a collapsing building. But Judge Caprio still wasn't finished delivering justice. "I'm also ordering you to pay full restitution to Rosa Martinez for medical expenses incurred due to Emily's delayed treatment, which according to hospital billing records amounts to $8,500. You will pay Mrs. Rodriguez's court costs and legal fees. And I am forwarding all evidence regarding your pattern of witness intimidation, your hit-and-run incidents, and your systematic abuse of disabled parking regulations to the district attorney's office for potential criminal prosecution. Furthermore, I'm recommending to the state attorney general that they investigate whether your behavior constitutes a pattern of disability discrimination under the Americans with Disabilities Act, which carries federal penalties, including substantial fines and potential additional jail time." Every word was another nail in the coffin of Richard Blackwell's carefully constructed life of privilege and immunity. His attorney was frantically trying to get his attention, trying to tell him to stay quiet. But Richard had completely lost control of himself. "You can't do this," he screamed, his voice cracking with panic and rage. "I have lawyers. I'll appeal this. This is absurd. I'll have your job. You're just a small-town judge who got lucky with some viral videos." The outburst sealed his fate even more completely. Judge Caprio's expression remained calm, but his eyes were ice-cold as he responded. "Mr. Blackwell, that outburst just added another charge of threatening a judicial officer. I'm adding 7 more days to your sentence. Bailiff, take Mr. Blackwell into custody immediately." The courtroom erupted as 2 bailiffs approached Richard, who was backing away from them like a cornered animal, his bravado completely shattered, replaced by the terrified realization that for the first time in his life, money couldn't save him. As the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, Richard was still screaming about his lawyers and his rights and how this would be overturned, but his words were drowned out by the spontaneous applause that broke out in the gallery. Former employees were crying with relief. Rosa Martinez was holding Emily tight, both of them watching the man who had caused them so much suffering finally face consequences. The bailiffs led Richard out through the side door, his expensive suit now looking like a costume, his Rolex catching the light one last time as he disappeared into custody. The walk from the defendant's table to the holding cell took exactly 90 seconds, the same amount of time Judge Caprio had spent delivering the sentence that would change everything. The aftermath was swift and more devastating than anyone could have predicted. Within 3 hours of the sentencing, video of Richard saying rules don't apply to people like me had gone viral across every social media platform. The hashtag arrogant CEO was trending worldwide with over 75 million views by the end of the day. News outlets from CNN to BBC covered the story. Legal experts weighed in on the appropriateness of the sentence, and public opinion was overwhelmingly in favor of Judge Caprio's decision. Richard's company, Black Tech Solutions, saw its stock price drop 40% within hours as the board held an emergency meeting to discuss removing him as CEO. The SEC investigation that Judge Caprio had mentioned intensified immediately, with federal prosecutors subpoenaing records and interviewing witnesses who suddenly felt empowered to come forward now that their tormentor was behind bars. Richard served his full 97 days in county jail with no special treatment, no early release, experiencing for the first time what life was like without privilege insulating him from consequences. His fellow inmates, learning who he was and what he had said about rules not applying to him, made sure his time there was appropriately educational. The cultural impact of Judge Caprio's sentence extended far beyond one arrogant CEO. Courts across America began taking a harder look at wealthy defendants who showed contempt for the legal system. Disability advocacy groups used the case as a rallying point for stronger enforcement of accessible parking laws. Rosa Martinez testified before the state legislature about her family's experience, leading to the passage of Rosa's Law, which increased penalties for disabled parking violations and created a victims' compensation fund. Emily Martinez completed her cancer treatment successfully and became a spokesperson for Children's Hospital. Her story inspiring donations that funded a new oncology wing. Judge Caprio's moment of stern justice didn't diminish his reputation for compassion. Instead, it enhanced it, showing that true kindness includes holding people accountable when they cause harm to others. The video of the sentencing became the most watched courtroom clip in internet history, studied in law schools as an example of proportional justice and judicial courage. 6 months after his release from jail, Richard Blackwell III was a completely different person, though not necessarily a better one. His company had fired him, his wife had filed for divorce, his mansion had been seized to pay restitution and legal fees, and he faced multiple criminal trials for the various offenses that Judge Caprio's investigation had uncovered. He gave one interview from his modest apartment, claiming he had learned his lesson and found humility through adversity, but most people who watched could tell he was just reciting the words he thought would rehabilitate his image. The real legacy of Judge Caprio's sentence wasn't Richard's dubious redemption. It was the message sent to every entitled person who believed wealth granted immunity from consequences. It was a justice delivered to Rosa and Emily Martinez, who finally saw their suffering acknowledged and their dignity restored. It was the inspiration provided to other judges who watched and learned that compassion doesn't mean accepting disrespect, and kindness doesn't mean avoiding accountability. Rules don't apply to people like me. 5 words that destroyed a $500 million empire and created a viral moment that would be remembered for generations as the day America watched real justice delivered to someone who thought he was above it. If you believe Judge Caprio delivered exactly the justice this arrogant CEO deserved, smash that subscribe button right now. Comment justice served if you think wealthy people who show contempt for the law should face harsher penalties, not lighter ones. Share this video with anyone who needs a reminder that in a real courtroom, with a real judge who has integrity and courage, money can't buy immunity and rules actually do apply to everyone, including people who think they're special. Judge Frank Caprio proved that day that kindness has limits, that compassion requires accountability, and that the most satisfying moment in any courtroom is when arrogance finally meets consequences it can't escape.